won't save you. We're opening the doors to a world where darkness doesn't just blind, it consumes the soul. Here, in the darkest corners of the night, even your breath can become a harbinger of nightmares. Question everything you knew about safety and comfort. Are you prepared to hear eerie whispers from nowhere invade your mind and torment every thought? Leave your fears at the door, because what we show you will make them burst forth. Are you ready to journey into the dark corners where every sound and shadow harbors an unknown danger? Sit tight and brace yourself, for the night is just beginning, and its horror could become your eternal companion. It's time to step into a world with no way back, where darkness will be your only guide.
The dark winter had enveloped the small town, plunging it into a deep and impenetrable silence. Snow, like a thick layer of fluff, covered the streets, turning them into nocturnal shadows where the night seemed particularly sinister. The streets were dead and deserted, as if life had abandoned this corner of the world. The houses, shuttered and locked, seemed to be in a slumber, but it was during these hours that events began to unfold that could frighten even the most daring. Elizabeth Moore, a young woman who had recently buried her husband James, sat in her cozy home, burdened by the hollow silence. She sat in the darkened room, surrounded by photographs and belongings of James, which were her only solace. With each breath and rustle outside the walls, it felt as if James's death was merely the beginning of unimaginable horror. The lamps flickered slowly, and the shadows dancing on the walls seemed alive. The silence of the night was persistent and overwhelming, and every rustle outside the walls felt like an echo of what had once been her life. Suddenly, her phone rang. Elizabeth jumped, her hands trembling as she looked at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but the line under the number read, "James." She whispered in terror and disbelief, "James," her voice quivering with fear and incredulity. It was impossible. James was dead. The candle's flame on the table flickered, and the shadows on the walls shifted as if reacting to her fear. She answered, and a voice came from the other end of the line. It was James's voice, but it sounded as if it came from the depths of the underworld, distorted with echoes of darkness. The words carried a tone of deep fear and desperation.
"Elizabeth, it's me,"
said the voice, with a chilling, unnatural undertone. "How is this possible? You're dead," she exclaimed, her heart racing and fear gripping her.
"I know, but I need you to listen,"
the voice replied, with a desperate and pleading urgency.
"There are things I didn't get to tell you, and I've ended up in a place where no one can find me. Help me."
But what was it that James hadn't had the chance to say? What terrible secret had he left behind? Why was he in this place, trying only to reach out to her through the phone? Why couldn't he leave this place and find peace? Elizabeth felt that something horrific and unknown was approaching, but she couldn't understand what it was. With each call, the tension grew. The calls became more frequent and disturbing. Each time she answered, James's voice grew more distorted and frightening. He spoke of a shadow that pursued him, of the place where he was, but none of his words made sense. Elizabeth felt her own sanity beginning to crack under the weight of this terror. Every word from James seemed increasingly sinister, increasingly like the darkness that was swallowing her own consciousness. How could this shadow have intruded into their lives? Where had this evil come from, and how was it connected to James? Why did his voice sound as though it came from the deepest and darkest depths of hell? What was this place where James had ended up, and why couldn't he leave it? Could this call be just a trick of the mind, or was there something more sinister to it? What happened to the souls of those who also found themselves in such a trap? Soon, sounds began to appear, not only from the phone, but within the house itself. Elizabeth heard strange rustlings and footsteps that could belong to no living being. The shadows on the walls seemed alive, their movements ominous and unnatural. The furniture in the house began to move on its own, as if controlled by an invisible hand. Every sound seemed like a scream from another world, piercing her mind. What if these sounds and shadows were manifestations of something far more sinister, something that had long been trying to penetrate her world? Elizabeth reached out to her friend Marianne, who had also started receiving strange calls. The voices and sounds on the other end of the line grew more frightening and ominous. Marianne heard whispers and fragmented phrases that seemed like threats and warnings. Every word was laced with sinister hints that created a constant sense of danger. Even her own home had turned into something horrific. Floors creaked, and the furniture moved as if controlled by an invisible force. What lay behind these calls? Why did the entity using James's voice manifest with such persistence? Were there other similar cases in their history, or was this something entirely new and unimaginable? Why had the entity chosen them? Was there a connection between James and what was happening? Could they be related to some ancient curse or evil that had long awaited its hour? One night, Marianne received a call in which James introduced himself, but the voice was distorted and eerie, filled with horror and despair. In the background, there were not only whispers, but also sounds that could be described as wild screams and muffled, distorted melodies. These sounds were so terrifying that it seemed as though reality itself began to warp. The lights in her house went out, and she felt darkness surrounding her, filled with ominous shadows. Each shadow seemed alive, their movements menacing and unnatural. What force could control these shadows? How could this entity manipulate the surrounding reality and invade their lives? Why had Marianne and Elizabeth been drawn into this nightmare? Was there a way to stop this darkness, or had they become forever part of its dark game? Could they find a way to destroy this evil, or would their own fears lead to their demise? Elizabeth and Marianne, filled with fear and determination, decided to find answers. They discovered an old, forgotten book about supernatural phenomena, which spoke of entities that used telephone lines to communicate with the living world. The book claimed that such entities appeared when unfinished business or unspoken words were left behind. But what exactly needed to be finished, and how could they free James and themselves from this evil? Could this book be merely a deception, or did it truly contain answers to their torment? The book also mentioned that entities could only be summoned or freed under certain conditions. Were there rituals or methods that could help deal with this darkness? And why was James bound to this evil? Were there other similar cases that could help them understand how to fight this horror? What were the true intentions of the entity, and why was its craving for suffering so great? Could they free themselves from this evil, or had it already consumed their souls? Elizabeth and Marianne decided to visit an old, abandoned house that they believed might be connected to the last days of James. The house stood on the edge of town and had been long forsaken. Rumors about its horrifying past only heightened their fear. When they entered the house, they found it covered in dust and gloom. The shadows on the walls moved and twisted, and every sound was absorbed by the impenetrable silence. They found an old phone and turned it on, preparing for the next call. But this time, the phone not only rang, but was surrounded by a mystical light emanating from the deepest depths. This light was so bright and sinister that it seemed as if the house itself was breathing darkness. When they answered, the voice on the other end was not James, but some ominous entity. It spoke of dreadful things awaiting them in the shadows, of being forever bound to this horror. Every word was filled with threats and warnings. Why was this entity connected to James? What did it want from them? How did it know such terrifying details about them? Could they understand what was happening, Or were they doomed to remain in this nightmare forever? When they tried to leave the house, fog enveloped the town, and the streets became endless and distorted. Shadows and sounds seemed to chase them, and they felt they had become part of something much darker and more sinister. The fog was a living entity, absorbing light and life, and it seemed to swallow everything around, leaving only endless darkness. Elizabeth and Marianne were surrounded by ominous shadows, which seemed absorbed by darkness and terror. What was happening in this house? Why was its dark aura so powerful that it could affect reality? And how could they cope with this evil that had already infiltrated their lives? Every action and every step seemed to only deepen their descent into the nightmare. Their own fears became part of this evil, and they began to doubt their sanity. Elizabeth and Marianne were drawn into an endless cycle of fear and horror, unable to break free from this circle. Elizabeth and Marianne never learned the full truth about James and the entity that used his name. The town sank back into silence, but the mysterious events left them with a constant sense of dread. Every phone call was a reminder that darkness could be closer than they thought, and that the nocturnal shadows might hide something far more terrifying and malevolent than they could ever imagine. The night, shrouded in silence, continued to harbor its darkness and secrets, leaving them in constant fear and anticipation of the next ominous call. The darkness that had already consumed their lives continued to devour their minds and souls, and they were doomed to become part of this endless night.